Let's go ahead and get started. I am Ashley Whitlatch, and I currently lead marketing here at Plato, and I'm super thrilled today to be doing our first webinar. I've got Chris Saint-Amant here with me today. He's the Director of UI Engineering at Netflix, your favorite show binge-inducing company. And he's an amazing technology leader with almost 20 years of experience doing consulting and product development. And he spent the past five and a half or so, I think, at Netflix. So today, Chris and I are going to be talking through how to build and develop high-performing engineering teams. And we hope that you walk away with some actionable insights that you can take back and implement with your team. So Chris, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I want to hear a little bit more about how you actually got to where you are. So just to start off, like, who's somebody that you feel like influenced you, and developed you into the career path that you've chosen today?
Yeah, so I started my career pretty young, and I worked at a very small technology consulting firm. And I had this project manager who coached and mentored me for about the first 5 years of my career there. And he was always in the trenches with the team, even when he couldn't actually do any of the coding or design work. And he'd stay late and order food, he'd run and get coffee. He'd effectively do whatever he needed to do to keep the team happy and productive. And he was incredibly selfless and always cared about the team's well-being, and that impression really stuck with me for a long time. And it's something that I always try to model with my team. And he was a really big influence on me. And there's one other person at that same company that influenced me in a slightly different way. It was my boss for many years, and he set this really incredible tone of really hard work. He was always putting in crazy hours, and I adopted that mentality for a while, which at a certain point wasn't exactly healthy. Mm-hmm. And after he left, we met up a couple of years later and over dinner, and I was stressing about this project and, working crazy hours. And he stepped back and he said, what's the worst that's going to happen if this project's a week late, right? You're building some software for some company to help make them a little bit more money. And, there's nothing life and death here, and it really helped. It was kind of shocking to hear that from him. Right. And it was something that I think came with time and perspective, and really stuck with me for a long time as well in keeping things in perspective and not burning yourself out, and keeping that good balance in what you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so diving a bit deeper into that management style that you have, I know at Plato, like, one of our values is move fast, and we trust that, like, each individual on the team is going to have ownership over, their projects. So that's obviously easier to do at a small startup versus, a large company like Netflix has grown to be. So how do you do that at scale on the engineering team? Like, is there, there's this culture, I believe, at Netflix of freedom and responsibility that I know you and I have talked about, and how has that really influenced you as a manager?
Yeah, so, we talk a lot about freedom, responsibility, context over control. And we went through this interesting exercise a couple of years ago where, each of us sat down and tried to boil down, like, what does the essence of that really mean for each one of us? And for me, it ultimately comes down to trust. And so trust that you're going to use good judgment in the decisions that you make. Trust that when you make mistakes, you'll learn from those and you'll share those mistakes with others so that others can learn as well.
Right.
And trust that you'll act in the best interests of the business and put the team ahead of yourself. And that helps avoid it becoming a political environment or people kind of going after things for their own gain. So for me, everything really boils down to that trust. A couple of years ago, I had a relatively new engineer on the team, and they were launching one of their first projects. And the engineer came to me and said, "Hey, we think we're ready to launch, but this one part of the feature set isn't working the way that we want to, and so we were going to cut that scope to get the initial launch out the door so that we can learn and go from there." And so I asked a couple of probing questions and to learn a little bit more and be a bit of a sounding board. And eventually he asked me, okay, great. Who needs to sign off on this? Who needs to approve us doing this? And I said, well, have you talked to your product manager and designer? And are you all aligned that this is the right path forward? And he said, yep. And I said, great, go for it. You're closer to the problem than I am. You know more about what you're trying to accomplish with this project, and you know the trade-offs, and I trust that you thought those through. And if you feel good, go ahead and make that call.
And do you feel like that's just something unique to Netflix, or is that something that you have cultivated like as a manager personally? Just this ability to delegate, because I think that's a challenge for a lot of new managers as well.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think I don't think that idea of, trusting your team is anything unique to Netflix, but I think for me personally, it's something that I've really had to get much better at Netflix. I think when I first moved into management, I made all of the classic early manager mistakes where I was diving in and, going back and modifying people's code after them, or, jumping in and correcting things that they were doing just because it was maybe not the way I would have done it.
Right.
And I learned pretty quickly that was not the most effective way to lead my team. And a few folks were pretty clear saying, okay, we need you to back off now. And so I learned that the hard way early on, and over time I had to get much better at that. And I think when you hire people when you bias towards hiring people that have good judgment and maturity and are able to make smart decisions, it makes it a lot easier. And these days, I know that every engineer on my team is a far better engineer than I am or ever was. So it makes it easy.
And humble. So do you feel like your management style adjusts at all, like based on the individual team member or generational differences? I know we chatted about this before. But I'd love to hear your insights on if you kind of adjust that style.
Yeah, so I think every person has different preferences, and for me, I think what it comes down to is communication style. I think that's the biggest thing that is different on a per person basis. So some people are better verbal. Some people are better with written communication. Some people need time to process feedback and come back later. Some people are much better at responding to that in the moment. So, one thing that we try to do a lot is bias towards written communication for making big decisions. And that helps people who may be more introverted or less likely to be the person who's going to raise their hand in the room and speak up over 20 other voices. And also people who may need time to process and think about a problem and take time to provide input and feedback. So we think that written style accommodates a wider range of personality styles and even comfort with the English language, for example.
Right.
As with any organization, my team, we have some folks who are quieter and more introverted, not uncommon in engineering teams. And so I have one engineer who really rarely speaks up in larger meetings, but she gets rave reviews from her stakeholders for being very proactive in her communication. But for her, this more often comes in the form of written communication. So she'll send them an email or Slack message to say, hey, heads up, here's how this thing is going. We encountered a few challenges here. Here's some options that I've laid out, A, B, C. Which way do you think we should go forward, and seeks input from our stakeholders that way, rather than being the one that's going to kind of raise their hand in the project meeting with 10 or 15 other people.
Right. And so really it's about shaping the way you communicate individually with people on the team so that they're successful, as opposed to based on some type of, like, if they're a millennial or Gen X, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think those are broad categorizations, but when you actually know the people and you have a personal relationship with them, you can gauge that and adapt that more specifically to the person.
Yeah, and kind of a follow up to that, I know you mentioned, and you even mentioned it, just earlier in the webinar, that balancing out the needs of the business and the team often make your own kind of personal interests last. So can you talk a little bit more about how that's affected you, or how have you been able to train yourself to do that, or be successful at putting others first?
Yeah, I think for me, it's what excites me and what motivates me is getting the right mix of people into the room and seeing them create something cool. I used to really enjoy that as a kind of project or technology leader, where I was really in the trenches and doing lots of problem solving and kind of pulling in other engineers and designers and solving interesting problems. But as a manager, what I've found that I can do a whole lot more by picking and choosing and pairing up the right people to solve problems, and then being able to step away and come back and see that they've created something cool. And so the better that I can set them up for success, the more that we can accomplish. And for me, that's just really motivating and exciting, because it means that we can accomplish a lot more as a team rather than I could have ever done individually.
Yeah. And we chatted about this a bit earlier, I think even yesterday when we were chatting, but Netflix is a bit of a holacracy structure in a way. Like, I don't know if it's pure holacracy, but there's some elements of that in there. So I'd say that's a fair assessment. But how do you identify leaders and managers on your teams with the way that you guys have structured your teams currently?
Yeah. So, I think we certainly have structure. We have people who are responsible for specific decisions and who are, have ownership over certain areas. So, there is certainly some structure to it. I think what is probably the most distinct about, what we try to do is really push as many of those decisions down as many levels as we can in the organization. Everyone is making dozens of decisions every day. And in engineering, a lot of what we do is about trade-offs, right? There's never going to be a perfect engineering solution, and you're never going to have infinite time to create the perfect product. So there's always trade-offs. So, when it comes to kind of effective leaders on my team, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean managers, I look for folks who can really effectively balance the business, the people, and the technology. And these are the folks that are good at surfacing the trade-offs between those three and kind of navigating them in discussions. These folks then also quickly earn the respect of their team and peers in other teams. And they're effective at influencing the direction of the technology or our organization or the business itself. And to do those things successfully, they really must develop strong communication skills. And I think the bar for that gets higher and higher the larger your scope is. Yep, sure. Exactly. And when it comes to like hands-on management of people, I think it's more about helping and investing in others and being a good judge of character, someone who proactively helps identify and resolve challenging interpersonal situations. For example, like we're all imperfect human beings, and we all make mistakes, and we may rub each other the wrong way from time to time. And I think the people that I see who navigate that very smoothly are the folks who I think have that potential long term. And so those are kind of the attributes and the qualities that I look for. Right. In terms of picking out specific individuals, some folks may come to you and raise their hand and say, I want to move into management at some point. Right. But I also encourage folks to identify the people on your team who don't raise their hand, but you think might have the potential, but need to be tapped on the shoulder and maybe nudged and pushed a little bit into thinking about that. If you only invest in the folks that are going to raise their hand, you may miss opportunities to increase the diversity of your leadership team, because you're going to bias towards the folks who are going to ask for things rather than the folks who are selfless and just keep their heads down and get lots of work done, but who may make a really great leader on your team someday. Those
reluctant leaders that sometimes I think are sometimes some of the best, right?
Yep.
They have that humble quality that enables them to be strong leaders.
Yep, exactly.
For sure. So I've worked alongside a lot of engineering and product teams for the past 10 years or so, and I've noticed that there are a lot of different motivators for individuals. So what would you say are some of those healthy motivators that you look for in potential engineering leaders?
Yeah, so anytime someone comes to me and asks, say, hey, I'm interested in moving into management at some point,
Right.
and what would that look like, and how can I get there?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I ask is why? What are you interested in? Is it because you want to have increased impact and influence?
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking to quote, call the shots and like be in charge? Is it, do they think it's the best way to increase their compensation? Or are they looking for just more challenges and more personal and professional growth? And so, digging in and kind of asking a handful of probing questions to really try to get at their motivations is important, because you may find that their motivations are more, hey, I think this is the best way for me to make more money and to have more influence. And depending on your organization, they may be able to do that very successfully while staying as an individual contributor.
Sure.
I look for folks who are motivated by that personal and professional growth.
Mm-hmm.
Folks maybe who feel like I don't have a lot more, challenges or interesting things to learn on the pure technology front. And I'm looking to learn something new. I'm looking to dive into a different set of challenges. And I think increased impact and influence is good. Mm-hmm. And, helping others and being selfless. And that's where I emphasize for them that, when you move into this role, it's going to be very different, and you're often going to be, last in line in terms of, level of importance. So there's, the business needs of your team, and then you're kind of last on the list there, and you really should be taking care of yourself last and putting the team ahead of you. So kind of highlighting that for them and making sure that that's well aligned with their motivations.
Mm-hmm. And so for those leaders that you've then identified, how do you kind of nurture them or help them along that career path? Do you get them mentors? Do you send them books to read? Like what are kind of some of those?
Yeah, I think looking for opportunities to give them larger and larger projects or initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite things to do is when people come to me and say, like, I've got a really great idea. I think we should be doing X or Y or Z differently. I say, that's a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Go for it.
Great, go for it. Like, here's some different people, connect the dots. Here's some people to go talk to, and see what you can accomplish, and see how well they kind of take the initiative and make those things happen. Now, of course, I'll try to give them a little bit of a buffer from their normal work responsibilities so that they aren't set up for failure. But looking at how they can influence and accomplish larger impacting work, and I'm giving them tips and advice and nudging them and helping them along the way. One thing that I've learned over time, and again learned this the hard way a few times, is it's tempting to say, great, I'm just going to give this person larger projects and just walk away. And it's great because I'm super stressed and overwhelmed as a leader, and I'm just going to give them this thing, and then I'm going to go keep doing my other work. And I've done that a couple of times, and it doesn't always work out well, because they need that constant coaching and advice along the way to make sure that as they're making mistakes, you're there to catch them. And sometimes it's okay to let them make those mistakes, depending on the scope of impact of making a bad decision. It may be better to let them fail and learn that way, rather than stepping in and catching them. Or when they come to you and ask you, hey, how should I do this? Instead of just giving them the answer, do a bit of the Socratic method and ask them questions of, okay, well, what ideas do you have? How would you think about this or that or the other thing? And how would you evaluate between those, and help them get to the conclusion rather than giving it to them?
For sure.
And I think the last thing, and I learned this from one of my peers at Netflix, who I think really excels at this, is kind of playing a shadow role. So what I mean is,
unpack that for us.
Yeah. So what I mean is, if you're there kind of observing them in different meetings or watching how they're running a project, don't interject in front of the rest of the team. So it'll be natural that if you're in the room, the rest of the team may look to you and just constantly deflect to the person that you put in that role, and let them tackle it. And then if you think that they could have done something different, pull them aside afterwards and give them that feedback rather than jumping in and correcting them in the moment, because that will potentially undermine their confidence and undermine their credibility. Same thing on like an email thread. So, you're copied on something and they do something that you think is slightly off or not quite, or you think they could say something differently. Instead of replying all and saying, well, yes, but, you could instead just reply directly to them and say, hey, here's another piece of information that might be useful for the team, or here's how I might have approached that, and let them own that rather than undercutting them. That's something that, to be honest, I'm still working on getting good at. It's very tempting, when you're busy all day long to jump in and just jump in, because it actually takes more time to do it the other way.
Right.
And so that's something that I'm continuing to try to get better at, and I can't say that I'm perfect at that all the time.
Yeah. And do you think, actually, that's a great point, because do you think that, sometimes maybe the better way is not necessarily always the fastest?
Yes.
When you become a leader and a manager, and especially with leading engineers, and do you find that challenging, or how do you navigate that? Because I think that's a very common thread where it's like we've always pushed move fast, iterate, move quickly, and then all of a sudden you have to kind of slow down when you're the person sitting at the top of the table.
Yeah, you have to create time for yourself for that reflection and time to think. And I've realized that it's not too dissimilar from when you first move from an IC into a management role, where, just like the example I shared earlier, it's really tempting to, instead of spending time with an engineer, coaching them through how to solve a problem, it's faster and easier to just go ahead and solve it for them.
Right.
And it's the same thing when you're developing other leaders. It's no different. It took me a while to reach that conclusion, but it's no different. You have to, instead of just doing it for them or jumping in with the answer, you have to take more time. It's hard. I don't have an easy answer for that. It's it ultimately becomes a time management problem for yourself, and thinking through how where you're choosing to spend your time on any given day or week.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for those members of your team that maybe aren't necessarily what we'd say like manager material now, but they kind of keep coming to you wanting a promotion or even just wanting to learn. I think there's probably those two different camps of people, right? Where you have those that are just kind of looking for a promotion and just want to move up the career ladder, and that's what they're motivated by. And then you also have the people that are genuinely perhaps just too junior to move up yet. So how do you sort of approach those two different groups of people?
Yeah, so I think, from the get-go, I try to be honest and transparent with how I'm thinking about where they are and their skills and their readiness.
Yeah.
And setting clear expectations at the beginning, that there are potentially two different tracks that need to be decoupled. So one is, that individual's personal growth and development and how they're doing in improving themselves and building certain skills that you think are important. The second is, what does the business and the team actually need? So is there a specific role that's open that this person would be a good fit for, or would the team be better served by finding someone else for that role, either someone else internally or externally? And so I try to make that very clear up front that those two things shouldn't be coupled together. So you may have a role and a need on the team, but that person's not quite ready for it. And so you go out and you find that somewhere else, or vice versa. They may be absolutely ready and you think they'd make a fantastic leader, but there's not a need. And so it would be, I think, irresponsible of you to go and create some brand new role when there's not actually that need on the business. So I try to make that very clear for the team, or for each person that I'm talking to, and then be transparent about where I think they are. If you are going to take that plunge and transition someone into that role, be candid with them about what your concerns and what your fears are, and say, hey, I know that there's no way to know and prove 100% that you're ready to take on this role. There are going to be things that you're going to stumble with and that you're going to learn along the way. Here's the areas that I think I'm most concerned about, and let's work together to figure out how we can mitigate those.
Right.
And I'm looking for them to also own that and come up with the ways in which they think they can close those gaps over time.
Mm-hmm. And when you say work together on it, like what does that actually end up looking like? Like just as an example, like do you connect them with people to talk with? Does it, like what are those elements?
Yeah, so I encourage them to, because back to that kind of time management problem, you can't be seeing
Can't do
them,
it all
observing
yourself.
them. You can't see them and observe them all day, every day. So often I will make sure that the peers that they're working with in that space, whether it's other product and other engineering leaders, designers, other engineers, et cetera, I'll be honest with them and say, hey, this person is working on developing these skills. Can you help them? And can you help provide them with feedback along the way and help provide me with that feedback so I can better coach them? And oftentimes before making a decision on whether to move somebody in a management role, I'm really tapping into those peers to get their take on it since they've seen that person in action. And if they don't think that person's ready or they have concerns, then I encourage that person, the individual, to work with those folks directly.
Okay.
And I've done that in several examples, where an engineer on my team, has been very honest with his peers about, hey, this is something I'm working on and please help me. And he's gotten a lot of really good feedback along the way that's helped him grow.
Okay. And how would there be, if you have an individual contributor who's really interested in going the management role, what is that, like one piece of advice or a bit of advice that you would give to them, their earlier career?
Yeah. This is certainly not my original idea, but acknowledge that going into management is a very different role, and it's not necessarily a promotion. That it's a significant shift in your day-to-day responsibilities. That the types of problems you're solving are very different, and the way you measure success for yourself will be very different. And I had an engineer about 6 months ago move into a management role on my team, and 3 or 4 months in, we were having a one-on-one, and he said, I'm having trouble kind of measuring success because I feel like when I was an engineer, you mostly left me alone, and we didn't have to touch base that frequently because I was able to run with things pretty independently. Now I feel like I'm constantly hearing from you and we're constantly talking, and it's like I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? And should I be worried that you're always kind of asking me things? And I said, no, actually I think that we're collaborating on different types of things, right? When you were an engineer, the types of things that you needed from me were very different, but now that you're in a management role, the types of things that you need from me are higher, and that I'm here to kind of help you and coach you and grow you. And in many cases, I'm simply excited about what you're working on, and I want to be there with you. And so hearing more from me and spending more time with me isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that you're not being successful.
Right. So that goes back to the communication piece that you spoke about earlier, like just making sure that you have that transparency and letting them know ahead of time that this isn't a bad thing. It's just a different type of relationship then.
And the reason that I'm asking lots of questions about this thing that you're working on is not because I don't trust that you've got it right. It's because I'm honestly curious and I want to know how things are going, and I want to be able to help out in whatever way I can.
Mm-hmm. And so for those engineering managers on the call with us today, what's that one piece of advice that you would give them?
So I think I'd go back to one of my first stories about, don't stress yourself out. Try to relax. Try to enjoy yourself. It's, for me, I've been really surprised if you told me 6 or 7 years ago that my job would consist of talking and writing all day long.
Right.
I would have looked at you like you were crazy, and I would have said that sounds miserable. But I really enjoy that now, and because a lot of what I get to do is meet and talk and work with really interesting, smart people with lots of different perspectives. And so, really trying to focus on those enjoyable aspects of your role and put things in perspective and not stress about things too much.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're going to open it up to questions. I think we have a few already in here. So I'll let you take a look at these.
Okay. All right. So first question is, how do you measure or get a pulse on team performance? So velocity or test coverage, et cetera. So, from an engineering standpoint, I don't really look at, I'm not spending time looking at the quality of their code or lines of code or anything like that. What I'm really looking at is, are they meeting the needs of the business? So
Right.
are they, the stakeholders that they're working with, are they happy with the quality and the consistency of the work that they're delivering? So it is a very qualitative measurement, but for me, I think it's really the right one. Mm-hmm. And because ultimately it comes down to our team's job is to deliver a high quality product for our customers and for our business. And the best way to measure that is by talking to our team stakeholders and making sure that they feel good about what's being delivered.
And I know that there's, being so data driven, I think just as an engineering culture in general across the board, regardless of the organization that you're at, do you think that there's some challenge with going that qualitative approach, like for people to buy into that, or?
Yeah, I mean, because as a business, we are very data driven. And so we do almost everything we do is heavily A/B tested. And, we're looking at all these core business metrics that we're trying to move through all the work that we do. Mm-hmm. However, but we also try to remind ourselves that even though we are in this very data-driven world, mm-hmm. there is an incredible amount of judgment that goes along with that. So data doesn't just tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. It doesn't tell you what things you should change, and it doesn't tell you where you're going wrong. So when it comes to A/B testing, for example, there's a lot of judgment that goes into figuring out what to test, how to test it. When you get the results, how do you interpret those results and decide what to do next? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to measuring individual performance, I think we lean more heavily on that judgment piece.
Right.
And so the judgment of the decisions that person's making and the judgment of the manager in evaluating how that person's doing and providing them with, timely, actionable, candid feedback along the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
So why don't we go to interviewing engineers? So question is, I'd love to hear Chris's thoughts on interviewing engineers, specifically engineering test methodologies. So mm-hmm. When I think about interviewing engineers, there's the easy stuff that is, what are their technical skills, right? Do they have the baseline technical skill set that you're looking for mm-hmm. for your team and the specific role on your team? But that's only half of the equation. The other half is all of these other attributes that we've talked about today.
Yeah.
It's judgment, it's maturity, it's thoughtfulness, respect, all of those things that will go into making them a trusted partner and a trusted team member. And those are the things that are much more challenging to interview for. And so we spend, I'd say, at least 50% of our interview time on those attributes. Many companies may spend 80, 90% on the pure technical skill set, but that's not all that it takes to be successful on a high-performing team. So, we'll ask people, hey, what's a time where you tried to influence or change the direction of your team, either the way the product was developing or the technology and the tools that you're using or the way in which your team was working? And how did you go about that? How did you go about trying to affect that change? Mm-hmm. And what's the time where you're successful or where you weren't successful? And so you start to get a sense of what their initiative is, how they go about influencing others. And then when they're not successful, how they go about handling that. What have they learned from that? What have they taken away from that? Is their answer, oh, well, they just didn't know what they were talking about and I got frustrated and I left, which doesn't show a lot of maturity in handling that situation. So I'm looking for them to demonstrate that maturity and that judgment through those stories and examples from their prior experience.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we've got a couple more in here.
So there's one here. What is the best approach to dealing with an engineer on your team that appears to be unmotivated, but is often very introverted? They tend to send mixed signals as to their investment in the organization, both with their time and interest. Yeah. So I think you really have to try to decouple those two things, whether the motivation versus being introverted. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to the communication styles earlier. So is your team set up in a way where the only way to kind of demonstrate your interest is through speaking up in team meetings and being the most lively, energetic person in the room? Mm-hmm. Or does your team, is there ways for that person to demonstrate their interest and passion through other ways that maybe they can do on their own time, through writing or through influencing people one-on-one rather than group settings? If you think that there truly is a motivation problem, sit down and ask them and just, say, hey,
have a conversation.
I'm getting a sense of here's some things that I've observed and that are leading me to believe that you're not super motivated, you're not engaged in what you're doing. And provide them with concrete examples and ask them what's going on. And you may be surprised by their answer. It may be something totally different. There might be something going on in their personal life outside of work.
Right.
Or they may very well be not motivated in their current role anymore. And I think it's on you as a leader to help find them a role on the team that maybe will better fit their interests and their motivations better. And that could be somewhere else in your same company. Right. And if that doesn't exist, help them find something somewhere else. It's not traitorous to help somebody find a job outside the company if that's ultimately going to be the best thing for them and for the company. So instead of, letting them, get less and less motivated and that coming through in unhealthy ways, mm-hmm. And negatively impacting the team and that person's happiness and well-being, help them. And, avoid it getting to the point where you have to let them go. Mm-hmm. And so having that kind of honest conversation with them can really go a long way.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
Let me take a quick look. So you mentioned not tracking things like velocity. Is this something that is tracked or is used more at the individual engineering manager or PM level, even if it's not something you pay attention to with your broader view? Mm-hmm. It depends on the team and what that team's specific objectives are. So with our team, where we're focused heavily on A/B testing, we look at that kind of as you often have like a portfolio approach. So you may have some tests and efforts that you're going after that are really large, multi-month efforts. And what you're biasing towards on those projects perhaps is getting the right thing to market and not biasing towards a very short time frame. So mm-hmm. you're willing to take more time, make mistakes, not have it all figured out. And so, as a business and as a team, you're okay with whether that project takes 4 or 6 months. In the end, that's not going to be material to the business because you'd rather get it right and get the right thing out. But we also have projects where the goal is velocity. And the goal is to, hey, we've got this track of experimentation that we want to go after. And it's all about opportunity costs. And if we spend 4 weeks on this idea, we don't think it's a great idea to go after. We're only going to go after this if we think it's going to take 2 weeks. And so you're judging the team based on how quickly they can iterate on ideas and ship tests and learn quickly. Mm-hmm. And also make smart decisions that when they start working on an experiment that does ultimately take longer than they expect, they don't fall into kind of a sunk cost fallacy and they say, we've already sunk 2 weeks into this, but it's looking like this is going to be a 6-week effort and we don't think it's worth it. Let's cut our losses and move quickly. So it depends on the part of the team. So yeah, there are parts of our team where that explicit goal is rapid learning and experimentation. And the more tests and the more learning that they can do in a shorter period of time, the better. Versus other parts of the team, you may evaluate them more on the quality and the ability to deliver something that meets really this larger goal rather than worrying too much about the time frame.
Right.
And I think on my team, we look to have a good balance of both of those types of things.
Okay. We got a couple more that just came in.
Why don't you go ahead and pick one? Do you want to pick one, Ashley?
Sure. I love this one from Nicholas. So how can you determine the company direction and, for example, like new features or improvements, and how are you involving some of these lower level engineers in this? So the individual contributors, how do you get them to be feeling like they're part of the decision-making process?
Sure. So we value transparency a lot. Just about everything we do inside Netflix is extremely transparent.
Right.
So all of the senior leadership strategy and discussion is captured in writing and is shared with the company in open Google Docs, and people can ask questions and comments on those. And those are shared and open for everyone in the company. And so we have kind of a quarterly, alignment and planning cycle that the company goes through. And, what comes out of that is a lot of really great written material that everyone can review and add comments to. And that provides kind of the strategic direction.
Do you feel like people actually do end up commenting, or
yeah,
those people?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. People, dive in, ask questions or comments.
Yeah.
We also have a Google Doc that's an open Q&A with our senior leadership. So any employee can put any question in there and it's answered in line within a couple of days. And you get, really interesting, really provocative questions in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that's kind of at the larger company level, but at the smaller organizational level. So for example, my team is really focused on growth and user acquisition. And so what we do is when we have new ideas that we're proposing, and those new ideas can come from anywhere, we have kind of this monthly forum where you can bring a proposal, and that's, again, typically a written proposal. You send it out a couple of days ahead of time, and then in that forum, anyone can come and discuss and debate that idea. So in many cases, it's the product managers bringing ideas, and everyone is asking questions and and challenging ideas, or even engineers and engineering leaders bring topics to that forum as well, about maybe a shift in direction or some new idea. And so we really encourage people to bring those ideas, open them up for the wider team that would be influenced by those decisions, and then really foster discussion and especially debate. We really want to hear dissenting viewpoints and alternate perspectives that will help shape the idea and make it stronger.
And so you feel like you support or even celebrate more those dissenting ideas, like you want people to debate and have conversations. And is that purpose to really just get people to think about it in a different way, or how does that end up resulting in moving a project forward?
It's to help make the idea better and stronger. We like to say that disagreeing silently is essentially traitorous, right? If you're sitting there quietly and you don't agree with it, but you don't say anything, then that's really disloyal. It's not being honest and true to yourself and to the company. Now we expect that you should have a clear rationale behind that. It shouldn't be just because you don't like the idea. We expect that you have some rigor and some thinking around that. Because everyone has different experiences, they have a different view on the organization, and they have varying levels of knowledge about what's happening. And so if we limit that decision making and the input to a small select group of people, then you're never going to get those other inputs and ideas. So we do make sure that ultimately someone is accountable to make a decision, and we call that the informed captain. And then it's that person's responsibility to seek out other disagreeing point of view and gather that and address those where appropriate.
Okay. And we had one more question just come in as well. So how do you as a company kind of help encourage those that perhaps come from other countries to work on the team? So if there is that language barrier, whether they're coming here, or I think also too, like for a lot of people that are now working remotely, we have a huge remote engineering culture kind of across the world now. So how do you guys approach making people feel inclusive and more understanding of conversations that are happening?
Yeah. So, for us, within our engineering teams, we don't have a really distributed environment. Everyone is in one location.
Right.
But as our company has grown and our product and marketing and PR teams our marketing and PR and content teams are in many cases based all over the world, and bringing those views of our customers in those parts of the world to us.
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes back to that relying on that written communication.
Sure.
And giving people the time to read and absorb those ideas, and the time to go back and provide input and comments in an asynchronous fashion, rather than having to always do that real time and in the moment. For me, I think that's what we've seen work the best.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have for Q&A for today, but I do have one last question that I want to ask you, and obviously near and dear to us at Plato, but what does mentorship mean to you, and why do you believe that it's important in developing a team?
Yeah. So, mentorship to me is really about learning from other people's experiences and hearing those stories and where others have stumbled. I talked earlier about making mistakes and learning the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
And while that is often important, it can get pretty frustrating if that's the only way that you learn. And so for me, it's always been really eye-opening when from the leaders that I've learned from, where it looks like they just know everything and they make everything look so effortless. But when you actually sit down and talk with them and learn about the stories and the travails that they've had over time, you realize that they didn't just spring fully formed like that, right? There's a lot of challenging work and hard learning to get there. And
realize you're not on an island either. Like,
yes,
everybody goes through these
yes,
same experiences.
yeah, exactly. So to me, I think that's really what stands out for me, and what I've certainly benefited from a lot in my career, and one of the things that motivated me to get involved in Plato.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, everyone, that wraps up our webinar for today. We've got a couple more closing things that I want to touch on. Chris, thank you so much again for being here today. I think
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
It's super great, and hopefully everybody is going home with some actionable advice that they can share with their team. I do want to give a little plug for those of you who have hung out with us to the very end for Elevate. It is our engineering leadership summit that's coming up in just a few short weeks on July 13th. We've got an amazing lineup of some really incredible leaders. Chris, I believe you'll be there as well, which will be really fantastic. And then for today, only for the next 24 hours, for those of you that attended the webinar, we have a $150 off code for your ticket. So absolutely go grab that right now. And thank you guys so much again for attending, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody.